Welcome to this NICEC seminar. I am very pleased to welcome you to the first of our events in this new year. So at NICEC, we host and support a series of events each year. We do 4 seminars and 2 longer network events. And these help to promote thinking and debate, developing a theory and enhancing practice in the area of career education and counselling and the fields of career guidance and career development. So I'm delighted to introduce this particular seminar, which is focused on social class. And this is something that we find often gets overlooked in discussions and interventions focused on equality, diversity and inclusion. And it's often because it's quite difficult to actually research. So this dedicated study was something that was a real treat for me and my colleagues who I'll introduce you to be involved in. So yes, I'm people who know me. I'm Emma from the Institute for Employment Studies, and I'm a NICEC Fellow. And my 2 lovely colleagues are with me today, and they're going to actually present on this topic. So my 2 colleagues here are Kate Alexander, who's a research fellow at IES, and her interests are in precarious employment and ensuring access to good quality work. And Kate led this piece of research that she's going to talk about. But she's also been leading work to support more broadly the Construction Industry Training Board that the study was for about 3 or 4 years now, Kate, isn't it? We've got a nice body of work that we've been doing with them. And also my colleague Dr. Kyla Ellis, who's a research fellow at IES too, and her research interests are sort of around education pathways and equality and diversity. So they're with me today, and they're going to do all the work really, and I'm just going to try and move the slides along. So apologies in advance if that doesn't work quite to plan. So we've got an hour and a half, so 90 minutes to go through this topic. So bit of an overview really in terms of how it will work. So I think we'll start off with a bit of introduction about the research project. And then a presentation on findings from the study around social class and its role in decision making and how it works as and through other influencers. And then we can have a bit of a break for a chat and talk and share thoughts and reflections. And if you've got any questions, but also if you've got any questions or thoughts and reflections, you don't have to wait for that bit. You do put things in the chat, and hopefully Claire will be able to pick up on that and run with that a bit as I'm lovely. Thank you, Claire. So that's the sort of first break we'll have, and then we'll do a second presentation, which is sort of grounding some of these thoughts and ideas and concepts actually in the construction sector and what it means for thinking about and supporting construction careers, which was our sort of remit in doing this study. And then we'll finish with another chance to kind of share thoughts and ideas and ask any questions. So yeah, as I said, do put anything that you want to talk about or questions or reflections or anything like that in the chat, and also when we come to those break periods. So I'm now going to try and share and put the slide up. Has that worked okay?
Yeah, we just got those big blocks, so yes, I think they're being hidden as we speak. Great. Thanks, thanks for a lovely introduction, and thanks everybody for joining us this evening. We're really pleased that we could be here and that you've all joined us to discuss our research findings about social class and its impact on people's career decision makings. Obviously, always delighted to be sharing our research, but it feels particularly important in this case because, as Emma said, one of our research findings was that the influence of social class often feels harder to see and measure, perhaps even than other demographic factors for individuals, for employers, and indeed for researchers, and potentially is less widely discussed than some other sort of elements of diversity and inclusion, despite, as we'll explain, having quite a profound role on our career pathways. So it's, yeah, really great to be spending some time this evening sort of bringing it to light and opening some discussions about it. So I'll start with a little bit of background into the research. Thanks, Em. So yeah, as Emma said, this is part of a sort of ongoing research project that we have into careers in construction for the Construction Industry Training Board, CITB, So CITB as an organisation aims to support the growth of the construction workforce in order to meet sort of skills and labour needs in the sector. And so they've got like a careers arm that approaches this by trying to inform and engage people about careers in construction, and also funding sort of careers education, information, interventions. And our research supports that work by providing evidence around very broadly around the careers landscape. Next slide, please, Em. So for this piece of work, CITB was really interested in understanding the role that social class plays in career decision making. And it was a very exploratory piece of research. So while it was commissioned by CITB, our sort of aims were broader than the construction sector and then sort of focused down. So we wanted to explore how social class influences career decision making, including career aspirations, but also sort of pathways and outcomes, to explore specifically the role of social class on career decision making around careers in construction, and then to use those findings to suggest ways that CITB can take a more class informed approach to their career strategy. So to do this, we started by conducting a literature review, and so that mapped sort of both theoretical and applied research on the role of social class and career choices. And we also tried to identify sort of examples of class-focused interventions in the construction sector, which I can talk a bit more about later. And then alongside this, we did some lovely in-depth quality research with lots of different groups. So we spoke to construction employers to get their views on sort of what the social class makeup of their organisations was, how they saw social class influencing people's decisions to enter and careers within the construction industry, and anything that they were doing to sort of help people from different class backgrounds to enter and thrive in the sector. So these were sort of people working in social value, HR, business development and sustainability within the sector. We also spoke to workers. So we spoke to new entrants to construction who'd been working in the industry for 2 years or less. And we had great conversations with them about their class background and how they felt that might have influenced or not their career path, their career aspirations and goals, as well as their experiences of entering and working in construction. Then we also spoke to sort of prospective entrants. So those are people that sort of have the skills and interests to work in construction, but are working in adjacent sectors. So things like engineering, manufacturing, and logistics. So we spoke to them about similar things to the construction workers, but we also explored what their perceptions were of the construction industry and whether they'd consider joining it and why or why not. And then we also spoke to some experts. This is people that had expertise in the role of social class on career entry and decision making. So these were sort of a range of people from academia, CIAG professionals, and some coaches, careers educators, those sort of groups. Thanks, Em. If I get the next slide. So these are sort of the three key themes that we've drawn out to talk to you about today. So mild spoilers on the slides. So first of all, Kyla's going to talk a little bit about social class and how it shapes people's career decisions. We're then going to go on to talk about sort of the spheres of influence. So how social class is mediated by parents, education, as well as personal preferences, and sort of ending by touching on the role of careers information, advice and guidance as a potential equalising factor in that. And then I'm going to go on to do deep dive sort of case study into the construction industry itself. So I'll hand over to Kyla to talk about social class and career decision making.
Thanks, Kate. That's a great introduction. Okay, Em, have the next slide, please. So first of all, I'm going to start with just a brief nod to some of our literature review findings, just to give you a bit of a background. But I don't want to labour this too much because I'm sure you will remember some of this stuff back from your sociology at school and university. So the sociology work is very clear that social class shapes our career aspirations, decisions, and outcome. And a particular relevance work coming from a Bourdieusian perspective highlights the importance of habitus and the role of different forms of capital. And it's a really useful theoretical lens in this case because of the way in which Bourdieu allows us to recognise class as being more than just about finance and how much you earn, but also recognising individuals' social networks, their cultural position, their cultural knowledge, and also make space for agency as well. So his work around habitus as an internalised mental structure linked to social class also becomes really relevant. Because in terms of careers and jobs, it means and that we're able to more easily slip into worlds and careers which align with our habitus and find it more difficult to break into ones which kind of don't align with our sort of familiar surroundings and settings. And then our repetition of behaviours and choices within that reinforce group norms and values, meaning that sort of our reading of what is possible, what we can do with our lives, isn't just about personal cognition, but formed through our relationship with those around us and our social context. So through this work, we can see how class frames and constrains and impacts on the career path, in that it helps some paths seem more natural, more possible, and more comfortable than others. And as I said, this is aided by access to different forms of capital, which possessed either individually or collectively provide advantages to individuals, or conversely, if we don't have access to them, provide disadvantages. So, as I'm sure you're aware, these have been added to and expanded by both Bourdieu and other theorists, but most relevant in this instance we found to be economic capital, in terms of the assets and resources that we have that can be converted into money and wealth, and how these impact on life chances. So the kind of realm we're looking at, the way in which we can use economic capital to secure educational advantages. So that might be through buying a house near a good school, in inverted commas, or accessing private schools, or getting into good universities. Cultural capital gained in the home through education, which includes qualifications, knowledge, language, and skills, helps us navigate that education system. And Devine in the literature argues that middle class parents utilise their knowledge and linguistic competencies to ensure educational success for their children. So it's those moments when you've got, the sharp elbowed middle class storming into school to demand the best. We've all sort of heard that stereotype. And then social capital is a reference here to social networks which are able to open doors to different career opportunities. So Ramage points out that someone from a deprived background is less likely to have access and fruitful sorts of information to routes into higher education. But as we found, and we'll talk about here, social capital in working class backgrounds can also provide you routes into different and also fruitful careers, such as we're going to talk about here, construction. Next slide, please, Em. So through this lens, we can see that class influences what is considered aspirational, what's considered comfortable, and what's considered natural, and that what this is will differ for different milieus. And in terms of this particular research, we can see how social class makes some careers seem more visible, more accessible than others, and thus creates the ramp that we refer to. But it can also foreclose access to others, presenting as a hurdle or a barrier. And using this sort of theoretical lens, we can kind of conceptualize this barrier or ramp without conceptualizing class as deterministic. So as we concluded in the literature review, people make agentic decisions shaped and constrained by their structural positions, while outcomes such as career paths are shaped by individual aspirations. These aspirations are in turn influenced and shaped by social structures, including social class. But we also need to think about how social class intersects with other social positions. Next slide, please, Em. Thank you. So intersectionality proposes that individuals' experiences and disadvantages or advantages are informed by the ways in which social categories work together, and these produce unique experiences. So we need to look across multiple positions in order to understand how someone's perspective and experience is formed. So the literature helped to kind of sensitize us to different ways in which things like ethnicity or gender or an experience of migration might inform people's experience of careers, their sort of aspirations and their different pathways. So, for example, Madood reported that many young people from ethnic minorities can be conceptualized as having what they refer to as ethnic capital. This is a combination of career-related values, parental aspirations, and cultural norms which prize academic achievement and professional success. And they conversely sort of compare that to working class white boys who reportedly have the lowest aspirations of all social groups, and link that back to the narrowing of available employment options, so the reduction of industry and the rise of the service sector. We also held in mind the idea around sort of, socialisation narratives for girls, that are directing girls in particular gendered roles around care and service industry where women continue to dominate, and drew on authors like Archer and Berrington, who talked around the idea that for some young people coming from migrant backgrounds, there is a sort of a pathway to achieving social mobility. There's an emphasis on that coming from their families who value good education and secure well-paid employment. So for some communities, they argue that social class can constitute a catalyst rather than a barrier to developing and sustaining higher career aspirations. So let's turn then to the data and we can see how some of that plays out. Thanks, Em. Okay, so first of all then, what we asked around from all our interviewees across all those categories that Kate talked about was we kind of dug into how they defined social class, and we found that the definitions and concepts around social class were subjective, they were very inconsistent, and they were complicated. Employers sometimes used underrepresented or disadvantaged. Some use the term socioeconomic status or background, but this was less frequent. So we can see even within that one particular group, we've got different ways of defining social class. And employers felt that there was a kind of related issue with measuring social class. Not only is it very difficult to land on a definition, but they were unclear as to what they were supposed to be measuring. Do you measure financial circumstances, so salary, or income, or family income? Do you sort of go more historical and think about class as being related to whether you access free school meals or parental occupation or parents' education level? And then there was a recognition that shifts in class position are problematic as well. So if we're measuring somebody's social class by their parents' background, what does that say for social mobility, and what are we ignoring there? And also, what are we not including? So we're not including a partner's income, a family income. So, there were lots of different issues with how to pin down class in order to measure it. And then moving on to the prospective and newly employed construction workers, their own articulations of their social class position suggested that they also have a different range of ways of defining social class. So some of them did talk about ways which kind of more aligned with the employers, in that they referred to their financial circumstances, their salary or their parents' occupation. But they also refer to more kind of fluid aspects and more sort of cultural aspects. So their living standards, their housing, whether they had money for luxuries. And some of them talked about things like, whether they had money for meals out or for holidays. So it was also about what money was spent on, as well as whether they had extra money. Or it was a combination of these. So it might be, your education level, but also whether you owned your own housing or not. And what was really interesting was some of the fluidity that we were seeing as well. So before we interviewed participants to check that they fitted into our sample, they had to fill in a screener. And that some of them, we found that what they wrote on the screener as to what their social class was differed by the time they were asked in an interview what their social class position was. So it's quite interesting to think about why there might be that kind of shift. Why is there that fluidity? And some of that might be to do with the values attached to social class. we found that there was quite a lot of working class pride expressed amongst our participants, and almost sort of some reticence to admit you're middle class amongst those who were defining themselves as middle class. We also found in the interviews people were more precise about their definitions. So they say things like upper middle class or lower working class, which they then went on to kind of expand on. It's also interesting to think about, did they discuss their class differently? Because at this point they're talking to a human rather than filling in a form. What is it about speaking to somebody that means you might change how you define your social class or how you see yourself, how you want to present yourself? So the range of potential modes of measuring and definitions then make comparisons of social class really problematic. And this also has implications for the kinds of claims that we can make. Next slide, please. So as we said, our academic evidence and research tells us that class plays a considerable role in people's decisions and also their outcome. Yet we saw immediately that class is hard to define, hard to measure, and in our sample, the descriptions and definitions were fluid, multifaceted, and subjective. In addition to that, we found that most new entrants and prospective participants didn't perceive class as influencing their career choice at all. And actually, they were much more likely to present themselves as viewing their paths as very personal decisions in which class played little or no role. Next slide, please, Em. Thank you. So there were some exceptions, but the majority were quite resistant to class, I would say. So some of them thought that class wasn't important at all, that they did not think about it or care about it. So our first quote here, I'm not too fussed about the class systems, to be honest. I just live my life, just be grateful for what I get. And maybe an influence, but not a major one. They say, referring to class there. It doesn't make it harder from my experience. It doesn't affect me. So there's a kind of an acknowledgement of the existence of class, but class in terms of their own lives and their own pathways is really downplayed. And we might want to think about why that is. Why are they downplaying those influences despite recognizing that class does exist? And might want to think about how hard it is to talk about something which might present you as not having agency or power over your own life, or might present you as being disadvantaged. Interesting that both of these participants are working class young men. So it might be that talking about class as something that causes a disadvantage goes against sort of these revered values of self-determination and personal responsibility that we're taught to kind of respect and aim for. Other participants recognised class as a potential barrier. They also rejected it in their own lives. So last one here then. Having a social class which gives you adequate access to resources means that you can strive for more potential careers, I'd say. But I'm not sure that being an engineer is particularly class driven. I think less so for me, but for others, I was always going to be an engineer. I don't think it would have mattered what class I was in. I don't think it would have been anything to do with class. For me, my current role, it didn't affect it. So we've got more of a clearer articulation of how class might influence different opportunities. But again, that rejection of it within themselves. And this was despite further analysis of the kind of narratives, which revealed the way in which social class actually did shape their opportunities. Next slide, please, Em. Thank you. So some referred to the role that their parents had played in financially supporting them. That might be through private education or through university. So as this one young participant says here, I went to my parents cap in hand, basically said, look, I want to go back to university and study to be an architect. And I was lucky for them to support me in that. Other participants related how their experience as in poverty as a child had led them to prioritise financial stability and to make sure that their families did not experience what they had been through themselves. So this one here said, I don't want to, bring up my kids in that same household per se, in terms of finances. I think just by kind of seeing how that being lower class, growing up in lower class environments affected us as kids, I think me kind of not wanting to be there or to repeat such is kind of reason why I'm being pushed or feel the motivation inside to push and increase my skill set and increase my pay. So we can see there how that agency interplays with the social class structure. And we shouldn't disregard these expressions of individual agency, but it is really important to put them into the wider context to understand what chances are open to somebody and how their decisions and choices might be informed by these classed childhood experiences. So whether you've got parents who you can go to cap in hand, or whether it's something that shapes your aspirations. So either of those might act as a ramp. But we do need to be really careful about sort of plucky tales of people picking themselves out of poverty and it being a motivator, quite apart from the scarring impact of poverty that we know about. This quote and the narrative doesn't show what the impact of class actually had and how difficult it was to make that pathway a reality. And so, as I said about poverty being scarring, we also picked up other interesting impacts of class as well, in terms of impact it had on confidence and a sense of the self. Next slide, thank you. So, as I said in the last slide, we saw poverty as a catalyst, but we can also see that social class impacts on this kind of confidence here. So in the first quote, I think subconsciously, I think there is a fear there in terms of what I'm good at and definitely what I can apply for. I think that the social background definitely has influenced the role that I'm currently in, which is just a labourer. And, you know, a labourer is, I don't know if you know a lot about construction, but they're almost like the bottom of the ladder together with cleaners. So the language is really interesting there as well. So like a sense that not only does he feel that he can't apply for certain things, he feels he hasn't done as well as others. So he's referring to not having achieved or not having gone for, and refers to himself as just a labourer or not going for more. And it reflects this kind of construction of manual jobs as being less than in a society which places value on different routes, sort of particularly around academic routes, which I'll touch on a bit later. So our second quote then. Maybe I could have achieved or maybe gone for more if I felt motivated to, but kind of went for lower down jobs because I was working class. Like if I was middle or upper class, I'd be more willing to do a university course or something. And I think, again, the language here is really interesting. So the participants' use of the words motivating and willing. And this speaks to a conception of social class as being related to mindsets rather than a structural barrier or a structural enabler. And these languages that he's pouring on here sort of are linked to these claims that if you simply work hard enough, if you have the right mindset, if you're motivated enough, you can move on from your social class position. And I think this use of language that he's adopting, it shows us how sort of potent some of these ideas of individual responsibilities are and the potential to obscure class effects, which we're seeing in some of these narratives. Okay, thank you, Em. So we can start to see hints of it already, but I want to focus a bit more now on some of the sort of wider spheres of influence, and how class plays out through these spheres of influence, sort of parents and education. So next slide, please, Em. Thank you. So the role of family, in particular parents, was found to be key across all parts of our research. So from our data, we found that parents play an important role in shaping the terrain in which aspirations are formed. So that, what I mean by that is, what kind of social environment are you enabling your children to grow up in? What school, what people you're mixing with, what kind of after school clubs, all those kind of things. What values are you giving to your young people? But parental influence is also tied up with other structural influences around class, gender, and ethnicity. So, for instance, we had one female participant talked about how her mum sort of impressed on her about the importance of marrying well, for example. But the strongest influences of all was the way in which parents acted as a role model on choices and aspirations. So this might be a direct role model, so somebody who is pushing particular areas or restricting certain areas or encouraging particular pathways, or this might be more indirect, so kind of shaping perspectives of possibilities, or being a role model, but literally having a particular job themselves and therefore enabling your child to see that that is a potential job, or a potential job that they don't want. We had one participant refer to seeing both of his parents at home on laptops and saying that he didn't know what he wanted to be, but he certainly knew that when he grew up he didn't want to have a laptop job, is what he referred to it as. Parents might also lack understanding or awareness and perpetuate misconceptions. We have to remember that they're not experts in the main. They might be experts in their own roles, but they have a vested interest and they aren't experts across the board. But their opinion is considered important to young people. Young people see their parents' opinions and views as honest, and they see them as being able to share real experiences. Young people referred to social media or schools as sort of selling particular ideas about careers, only giving the positives. And young people were very clear that they wanted they wanted the plus and the minuses, they wanted negatives, they wanted warts and all about different jobs. And they felt parents were able to give those kind of real experiences. We can also see how family connections can provide access to work experience and how this can be classed. So the difference between whether you're enabling your child to have work experience at the building site or at the solicitor's office. So there is still space for others to impact career decisions, so schools, CO professionals, and also chance encounters. For example, we did find that later on in careers and jobs that sometimes people made sort of informal peer models and informal sort of mentors that really sort of helped and shaped their pathways. But we did find time and time again across various bits of research that parents were the most of it influential. And although this can be problematic, you know, they do want the best for their children. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of educators' influence, we also found that young people saw teachers or careers advisors at schools as very trusted. They said teachers do not lie and they have our best interests at heart. Still relatively less influential than parents, but definitely up there. So in terms of how they're influential, they can be influential in terms of the subjects that are studied that shape those pathways from early on. That might be because, you know, you're picking subjects because you have a particular affinity to a teacher who's made that sort of, you know, been very passionate about their subject and made it something you enjoy, or it might be through conversations with somebody that you trust. They're also a conduit to career support as well. So tutors and other teachers might be the ones who are actually giving career support, even if they're not themselves careers teachers. That might be one of the roles that they've been given within a school. And so they're able to shape pathways and aspirations. However, we also found some problems there as well, in that their own perceptions can sometimes impact the guidance given, in that we found that educators often have a lack of industry knowledge and tend to focus on academic abilities and pathways. But it's important to note that their focus on academic pathways is not sort of a failing of teachers. It's part of a sort of a wider social norm, a backdrop, if you like, of how society sort of presents young people's ideal path and influences young people's own sense of what they should be doing and what they then end up judging themselves against. Okay, so if we have the next slide, so what we're talking about here is this idea that aspirations are not naturally occurring. They're informed by social structures. They're informed by things like government, media, schools, careers professional, and the dominance of particular classes within these social spheres as well. So just to draw from the literature review, although aspiration might mean different things to different people on an individual basis, at a societal level in the UK, a normative and socially acceptable reading of aspiration has become intrinsically linked with climbing a career ladder, and in tandem with that, gaining academic qualifications. So this has led to a persistent framing of higher education as a kind of a golden pathway. And we saw this in the literature review, but we also saw it in our findings interviews with young people, with the prospective and the new entrants into construction, that their experience at school was very much that they were shown a particular pathway down education into higher education as being the ideal route. And other pathways, including vocational routes, were sort of devalued. They were less obvious. There was much less information about them, and they felt more at sea in choosing them, or not even able to choose them. So there's a real social push and a support network around that entry to university. But there's some questions to be answered around whether it's still generating those desired outcomes. You know, in this coming wave of sort of AI and problems around graduate unemployment and wages, is it still something that you're going to reap the same rewards with? And we're finding that construction itself was framed as a low aspiration by educators, and that was often taken on by a lot of the people we were interviewing. Even despite the advantages and prospects that Kate's going to talk about later, and the fact that it's a space of potential social mobility and has lots of positives for it for lots of people, it was framed as being sort of a lesser than path. And this affects middle class young people in terms of there's a pressure for them to achieve and follow this kind of class pathway into university. And it's questionable whether middle class young people are making this sort of foray into traditional working class jobs in the same way that we are seeing some working class young people making their way into a more academic route and sort of aided in that way. There are instances where individuals are able to move out of their class habitus then, for example, but we have seen through the literature review how institutions sometimes intervene and reorientate aspirations. And so, for example, Crew found multiple accounts of alienation and hostile encounters reported by working class academics studying and working in higher education. And in our own research, we found middle class people reporting toning down their accents, in order to fit in and not stand out and to avoid teasing. So breaking out of your particular habitus into different pathways is particularly problematic, but more so perhaps when the kind of the social structure is really focused on one ideal route, and that aids to that sort of barrier element that we've been referring to. Okay, next slide, please. So as I sort of noticed when we were referring to the literature, we also sort of were quite sensitive to the role of gender and ethnicity. It's important to note that our sample was majority white, and that nobody mentioned directly ethnicity as an influence. But we did have one participant refer to his cultural background rather than his parents themselves, and seeing his cultural background as an important influence on his career decision. And he related that having Indian parents was key to why he pursued what he referred to as a traditional career in engineering. And he noted that he felt it was important for them to see him work really hard to get that traditional profession, because when they first came to the UK, they had nothing, and he wanted them to sort of feel that he had made the most of what they had given him and sort of hadn't wasted what they had sacrificed for him. So we saw that kind of reflected what we'd read in the literature review, but it wasn't a sort of a majority view. It wasn't talked about across the board, but as I say, it was a majority white sample. Similarly, gender wasn't noted explicitly as a key influence on aspirations or career directions. We had a majority male sample, but we did have some women who, and they did all discuss gender at some point, and I'll refer to that in a minute. None of the men in the sample noted gender at all. So in terms of our female participants, we can see here, again, although they're not talking about gender influencing themselves, they're talking about gender in the abstract as a potential influence. So we have this 41-year-old woman here saying, women have different skills. We might not be very technical, but actually my attention to detail is far better than a man's. I can also make friends with the client and, that kind of thing. Whereas, my colleagues will be battling. So whereas I can win the argument, but in a different way. And then I think women would be like, do you know what? Let's go. Let's get mummy Linda in, because do you know what? Linda is going to work Monday to Thursday, but on those 4 days that she's working, she will work hard. She'll be efficient. And also women soften. Men behave better when there's a woman around. Generally, as a rule of experience, they shout at each other, but they never shout at me. And it's really interesting to see then this conceptualization as women talking about women and men having different roles. And this is, although they didn't talk about it themselves, if that is your conception that women have a particular set of skills, it is likely to indirectly influence what roles you consider possible or desirable. And if this view is shared by employers, it's likely to shape what kinds of roles or opportunities they open to women. So these perceptions frame what roles are considered suitable and sit alongside social class. Lastly, then, in terms of sphere of influence and sort of linking back to my points around making sure that agency is taken into account, we can see the influence of personal preference coming across here. We were keen to explore that, not just in terms of sort of our careers, but what people wanted from their lives more broadly and how their career paths might fit into gaining that. And it was interesting that we found remarkable unity across all of the groups at this point. And we should note that although it didn't sort of differ around social class, what we don't see is how the impact of social class was in attaining these sort of shared goals. So there was a wide range of motivators and drivers within social class backgrounds. So what they wanted from work in terms of like what the environment offers them, what the work offers themselves. So it might be in terms of like, is there scope for promotions? Is there scope for earning well? Is there scope for travel? Where the work is was important. You know, some people expressed a keen to travel, others were keen that work was in their hometowns. Across the board, most people were talking about the need to progress, the need to learn, so developing skills, increasing experiences, and continue to learn. So there was a strong sense that people didn't want to be to stagnate. Outside of the workplace, there was a real focus on happiness, on a good work-life balance, and these were consistent drivers. And interestingly, earnings didn't really pop up as a key driver. It was more about financial stability or being comfortable or having enough when it did crop up, and it was secondary to those other aspects. Okay, so people didn't tend to note it as the first influence. Okay, so I'm going to pass back over to Kate now to sum up briefly how that influences on SEAG.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kyla. That was wonderful. Yeah, so I think we found in the literature that within, all these sort of intersecting class spheres of influence, that there's, a very clear role for careers information, education advice, and guidance to play in providing a more level playing field in terms of access to information and aspiration, regardless of an individual's class background. So, obviously that includes sharing knowledge about different routes and careers that individuals might not otherwise be exposed to or encouraged to consider in sort of their daily life, but also by offering sort of access to capital outside of the family, for example, offering encounters with a variety of employers and industries can help people to sort of make those social connections or learn certain ways of sort of thinking and speaking and being that could help them, enter something that's really good for them that they might not have otherwise considered. And this seems to be particularly important for people from working class backgrounds who tend to have less access to sort of hot information or non-formal careers informations from their parents. So this was kind of related a bit to Kyla's point about the impact of social class on people's confidence and a feeling that whereas middle class parents might feel very confident to be a source of guidance or a source of influence that can help their children, do the best for themselves and be happy, working class parents often felt less confident and viewed the child as the expert. So, they're getting less guidance from home. So it's even more important to get it sort of through more formal routes. And, we know from our interviews of experts that this is very well understood by careers practitioners, and it's reflected in sort of the range of interventions to improve access to high quality careers information and guidance from disadvantaged young people. So we're going to move to a discussion in a minute, and one of the topics we're really keen to get your views on is how this sort of potential to be an equalizer can be maximized within sort of relationships and discussions between practitioners and the people they work with. So we present in CITB with quite a lot of like suggestions for what good practice looks like, and quite a lot of these are way broader than social class and probably talked about and fairly well known. For example, sort of the importance of employer encounters and work experience and working with industry, the role that early and sustained careers related learning can have in sort of tackling these quite ingrained impact that social structure can have on people's aspirations. but the literature also suggested the potential of sort of acknowledging class in our discussions and speaking about and uncovering its impact on what people might want to do or feel able to do or feel unable to do. So I'd be particularly interested in hearing if that's something that you have done. And I saw somebody in the chat saying they've been talking to their year 12s about social class earlier. So I think that that's a nice segue to our discussion. So if you move on to the next slide, and I'll quickly read things out, but then maybe we can stop sharing so we can all see each other. So yeah, I can see that there's lots of lively discussion in the chat. So we're really just interested in hearing your thoughts, reflections, and any questions you have for us on what we've shared so far. But it'd be very interesting to us to hear about how these findings reflect your own experiences, sort of professionally, of how social class is influencing people's career decision making, how you sort of work with or against those class-based influences in your practice, and what we can do to make sure that people are finding the right role for them, regardless of what their class background might be suggesting to them about what they should do.
Thanks very much for that. You've picked up that there's been some lively chat, and I think Stacey, you were very active in that because you've come hot foot from editing your own thesis in a sort of similar area. So you sort of picked up some very key points. Do you want to take the baton, Stacey, and sort of bottom out some of the issues that emerged in the chat?
Sure. Sorry, my partner's just got home, who is working class and works in construction, which is why it's a particular interest to me. So I think, yeah, there's something there, isn't there? I mean, I thought it was really interesting. My sort of first comment was about the middle class person on one of the earlier slides saying class doesn't have an impact. They were listed as being from a middle class background. And they basically said class doesn't have an impact. They'd have been an engineer irrespective of their background. And to me, that just feels a little bit naive because I think somebody later on said, you only kind of acknowledge privilege, but you only kind of miss privilege when you don't have it. And I think there's a lack of understanding there for that person, perhaps. And it's totally fair. They're just talking about their own experiences and their desire and motivation and aspiration to be an engineer. But that aspiration, motivation, whatever, and all the systemic and sort of cultural factors that surround that might not have been in place if that person was brought up working class and they were from a working class background. So I just found that a little bit kind of interesting. And then particularly, I think there was a slide or two later where there was a working class, a young working class man talking about how they didn't have motivation for certain careers because of their class background. So again, it's kind of pitching those two sort of against each other. And then picking up the conversation about the definition. Definition is so difficult. But I think a lot of our time gets bogged down focusing on the definition. And actually, if we kind of set that aside a little bit, I'm not suggesting it's not important, I think it really is. But if we set that aside and actually listen to the lived experience of people in different spaces, then actually what we see is that class is still important and it is still experienced in a very effective way, in that very felt way. And actually, classism is still experienced in that very felt way. So when we're talking about class, it often gets kind of pulled apart because of the definitional complexity. But just because something's difficult to define doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying. And I posted a small, very small piece of writing, a few pages from Geraldine Van Buren. So Geraldine is the chair of the Alliance of Working Class Academics, and she wrote this at the back of a book around the lives of working class academics. But she's an international human rights lawyer, so she knows her stuff when it comes to kind of legislation and legal stuff. And she wrote these 4 pages, and I remember reading it and just thinking, that really helped me make sense of the definitional complexity. So not because I think she gives the definition, but I think she explains why having a definition isn't the be all and end all to actually caring about class as an effective experience.
Thanks for
I don't
that,
know if that kicked
Stacey.
everything off.
It's really helpful. Nadia, I know you wanted to come in as well.
Yes, thank you. And I just thank you very much for this presentation. And I'm sitting there and kind of just saying, yes, that's exactly what I see as a career advisor in a state secondary school. And interestingly, the first thought was that usually people who talk about constructions are students who are thinking about leaving year 11, they're struggling academically. So there's kind of this, they walk in and they say they want to do it. Don't see many of year 12s talking about it because somehow they're already programmed into the construction is not something aspirational. And the thought was also that last year I finished my master's in career development, and my topic was I asked adults who grew up in economically disadvantaged backgrounds, so they had to be free school meals. So I decided to make it more specific for the sake of my own sanity. And I asked them what helped them to make their career successful and what does it mean successful career for them. And interestingly enough, that the thing what was similar for them is that the change of their situation, like one of your participants, he said, I want better for my kids. And basically that was the main theme through my 7 participants, but they wanted to make it different from what they grew up, and they were motivated enough to change, and they made success out of career in different ways. And finishing this research, I said, okay, I'm going to go and do something different about my year 12 students. I'm going to try and make it for those who are in this position. I'm going to try to help them and be there for them. And I found that they're not motivated. They're not motivated at all. Like, no matter what you're trying to do in order to show them how they can navigate, they're not there. So the lack of motivation, I think, is a very big issue. So while there are some people who are motivated to change and some people who are not motivated to change. And that's what brings me to this year 12 talk that I had today. I basically said, I'm going to introduce them to a social career learning theory today. And I had a group of 7 of students sitting there and telling them that you actually already discarded half of the jobs before you were probably 5 years old, because all the influences that you had from your background and the experiences you had. So I basically sent them home after period 5 to think about it, and we're going to meet in a couple of weeks again.
So quite a thoughtful approach to the career development and to try to stimulate fresh thinking, because that was one of the challenges laid down, wasn't it, by Kate? What do we actually do about this in terms of actually encouraging a wider sense? There was one thing in the chat, Rosemary, from you about the 93% club. Do you want to say about any direct experience you've had of that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if any of you are aware of the 93% Club, but it's been set up by someone who shares a lot of stories about their own background and their very disadvantaged background, social class background, and they went into a career in law, which is, and how when they went to university they were out of step and all the things that they did to fit in. And it's a lot of, when I've talked to people, and my own background as well, when you talk to people who've transitioned from one background into another and how they've had to sort of mask and fit in to sort of get on, I think is quite an interesting concept. And the other thing I wanted to share about the 93% Club is that they're setting up this quite broad network so you can volunteer to be a mentor. They're trying to create, I suppose, an alternative to the privilege that's often children from private schools get through their network. So they're building on that sort of social capital through the 93% Club. So it's just creating a bit of traction, and they're getting employers involved. And the person I shared who's in the chat, Joanne Conway, she works for a law firm as well, and she's really active on this, and she's actually doing some research as well. But just recently, my organisation, the Career Innovation Company, we work with employers. We did some very interesting work with the BBC, where we ran a career development program, and it was for people who identified as having a working class background, and they were people who, for whatever reason, their career wasn't accelerating in the way they would have liked when they compared themselves against others. And this was a very proactive approach. And basically the work we did was all around overcoming sort of some of those self-limiting beliefs, but also practical strategies, what you can do to get onto to be better at being an internal candidate, basically, and compete. So that's just a couple of things to share, really.
Thank you, Rosemary. That's really interesting. I'm just conscious of time. Kate, did you want to come back on the case study? Because we'd originally said in the programme 5:50 to move on to that. What do you think? And we could pick up some of these points again.
Yeah, 100%. We've sort of got some time at the end to continue the conversation, and perhaps people will have some more thoughts after we've talked a little bit about how this plays out in construction specifically. So yeah, sorry, Jill, can see your hand. You'll be first on the list when we come back. You're all right to share the slide again, Brilliant. So, obviously, quite a lot of our research focused on how class plays out in career decision making around construction specifically, and a bit of a broader look about sort of, what is going on with social class in construction? How are people from different class backgrounds being supported into and within the sector? So if you could go to the next slide, please, for a bit of sort of background and context for anybody not familiar with the construction sector. So it's a big sector in the UK, makes up about 9% of the UK workforce, and it's also a sector that has fairly persistent sort of skills and labour shortages, and also offers, some fairly good opportunities for sort of high paid work that is going to be needed 30 years in the future and that can't be automated. So in lots of ways there's it sort of has something to offer for if you're a young person or career changer looking for a sector that's hiring and will continue to be hiring. And it offers sort of different, a varied amount of opportunities for people with different sort of skill sets and interests. Because I think one of the main things that we always come back to in our construction industry research is how incredibly varied it is in terms of the roles available, the career pathways and routes in. So I think when you say construction, people sort of tend to think of Bob Builder and tradespeople, which obviously is a big part of the construction sector. But there's also lots of like off-site supporting professional roles, often graduate roles, as well as sort of very highly skilled technical roles like architects, or we've talked to archaeologists that have worked in the construction sector. So yeah, there's lots of pathways in, from sort of coming in at the entry level requiring very little experience and qualifications, all the way up to roles requiring sort of higher master's degrees, from sort of apprenticeships to grad schemes. And so this means that in theory, it's a sector that could meet a very wide variety of career aspirations, whether you're, really keen to work with your hands, or to, work, have a lot of responsibility in an office, or to have a really like brain knowledge economy kind of job. It's all there, but it also presents, a real big challenge in educating, informing and supporting people to consider and enter the industry, because it is complicated and hard to navigate, in particular sort of informing people of the perhaps less stereotypical construction roles. Next slide, Emma. So in terms of sort of the class composition of construction, following on from our very interesting conversation about how hard it is to measure, we found it really hard to find any sort of solid evidence on what the class composition is like in the construction sector. the employers that we spoke to were all really interested in social class, and lots of them had really interesting reflections on their own experience of being of different class backgrounds and working in construction, but none of them were measuring it. And in large part, this was due to not knowing how to define it. As we've spoken about, they didn't really know what question to ask, but they also had a lot of difficulties collecting sort of diversity, equalities, information in general because of the structure of the industry. So construction is really has a lot of sort of self-employment and a lot of subcontracting. So you might get like a really big construction employer that's working on and has been contracted for a really big construction site, and they might be able to survey their employees, their direct hires, but they won't know what's going on with the subcontractors or with the subcontractors that their subcontractors are subcontracting, you know, particularly the sort of SMEs, small traders, one-man bands, who are a really big part of the workforce. However, and I feel more confident in talking about this after the discussion on sort of the validity of felt sense when we're talking about social class, there were really strong sort of assumptions, anecdotal evidence on the interesting role that class plays in the construction sector, which I think made it really interesting to research, because construction traditionally, and in those sort of traditional construction roles, has been a working class industry that's accessed through sort of family businesses, apprenticeships, and on the job training, which makes it, you know, perhaps a bit different. I think when we were doing our lit review, a lot of stuff was about, you know, how do we get people to go to university, and how do we get working class people to be more aspirational? But here we've got a sector that is considered more working class, and while I'm going to come on to in a minute, it's also considered by people we spoke to be a sector that offers very good opportunities for working class people, and particularly for social mobility, which, yeah, also interesting in terms of the fluidity of class. I think that it can also mean that construction can be devalued. I think that there's a sense that construction can be seen as sort of a fallback route for people that don't do very well at GCSEs, men who don't do very well at their GCSEs. Well, you know, you can go into construction, which can then serve to sort of devalue the whole industry and make people perhaps less interested in considering it, even though they might very well find a fulfilling career there. And I think that point on sort of who perhaps gets filtered into construction really comes back to Kyla's point on intersectionality, because a strong finding that we find every time we do our construction industry research is the prevalence of this sort of stereotype, maybe not, of the sort of on-site construction culture as being sort of a certain working class masculinity or lad culture that can be off-putting or hostile to women. And, you know, in other research, we have heard experiences that people have had of there being a sort of lad culture on construction sites. So I'm not saying that it doesn't exist, but this sort of broadly held stereotype, I think, really affect whether or not people will or would consider working in construction. So we've kind of got all of that going on one side, but that's more to do with the sort of on-site roles. On the other hand, the sort of off-site technical and professional roles were spoken about by people in our interviews as almost sort of a separate track in the sector for more middle-class people. They go to university and they get an office job and they sort of become a manager or a surveyor or an architect, and then working class men go on and work on site. And obviously that's very reductive, but that is how people tend to talk about and view the sector. And so I think if we're coming from a perspective of wanting everybody to be able to find good work that aligns with their interests and their values, and, you know, we might want that because we want individuals to be happy, or we might want that because we're an employer who wants the people that come to work for us to be able to maintain a career and stay in there, right? It's no good if we're sort of telling every working class boy that doesn't do very well in his GCSEs it's all right, you can go work on construction, and then turns up and actually really doesn't like working outside or in the rain. He's not going to stay, and it's not, it's not useful for anybody really. So these sort of class stereotypes and patterns in construction can be problematic, and I think that works both ways. We want everybody who might enjoy the benefits of working on site, around sort of camaraderie, being outside, not staring at a screen, using your hands, getting to be quite creative. We want everybody that might be interested in that to consider it, or to be prompted to consider it. We also don't want people pushed into it because of their class background. And there was a sense that could be happening at the moment. Next slide, please. So yeah, as I was alluding to earlier, there was a really strong sense among our interviewees that construction provides opportunities for social mobility that other sectors don't offer. There's sort of this classic story in construction that we hear, particularly from the employers that we speak to, are often quite high up, of sort of being a working class person that started at the bottom of the sector with no skills or qualifications, and they work their way up until they're sort of in a high level role and earning their own business and earning really good money. And we do know that in general, as far as sort of entry level roles go, construction does pay very well, and there are good opportunities to learn on the job and progress, particularly to start your own business. But we were aware that these people we were talking to were the people in these nice higher up roles, and also some of the people that we spoke to in part of our interviews, had been labourers for quite a while, and so you don't want to just cherry pick the success stories. But I think that there is promise there, and I think that can also be supported by the fact that construction employers are often working on sort of government contracts. They've got social value clauses, and they are sort of having interventions to support disadvantaged and underrepresented groups. There's always the language that they use, but as Kyla said earlier, that makes it very hard to tell whether that's anything to do with social class or not, because nobody's using that language or measuring it really. So again, we're kind of coming back to this problem of there's stories and sensors and examples to suggest that it's a really good sector for social mobility, but we need a little bit more evidence. Next slide, please. And we also found that there's a number of sort of class-based barriers to entering construction. But while, if we're talking about perhaps more professional roles, graduate roles, we're usually talking about class barriers to working class people, I think that in construction, these can kind of cut both ways. So I think on the one hand, apprenticeships are a very traditional role route into construction, but they could act as a barrier to the poorest people who can't afford to spend a few years on an apprenticeship wage to sort of invest in their future career. So that is a very real barrier. We also know that degree apprenticeships are becoming very competitive. Many are held by people from more affluent areas who are sort of using the same access to capital that might have traditionally been associated with accessing a university placement, and instead, kind of going down the apprenticeship route to avoid fees and have a bit more job security at the end of it, using their middle class savvy for that. So there's sort of some interesting things going on in terms of apprenticeships and social class at the moment, I think. And then on the other hand, more people from more middle class backgrounds might be put off by the sort of stereotypes around construction that we discussed earlier. And we also know that social connections are so important to knowing about and accessing opportunities in construction. Our researchers, consistently found that those who know somebody who works in construction are more likely to know about the sector and more likely to be interested in working it and find it easier to enter. So if construction is traditionally quite working class, it might be harder for an interested middle class person to enter it, or to find out about it or know about it. And then I think that we've got this point that sort of everyone is affected by the social positioning of higher education as the aspirational pathway that sort of everybody is supported to enter when they're doing their A levels. Although hopefully that is changing with sort of what some of the more recent careers legislation around the Gatsby benchmarks improving access of information to vocational routes. And perhaps a sense that there's diminishing returns around higher education. So I think that that's interesting space to watch. But certainly for now, I think that the broader societal norm is that you should go to university and that construction is not an aspirational career. So I think that that's, again, sort of asks us the question of how can people find the right role for them when we know that social class shapes what they aspire to and makes some options easier than others. So I've got one last slide to finish up and then we can have a little bit of a discussion. So yeah, to wrap up and to go back to the title of our presentation, career decisions are informed by social class from an early age, and that what we believe is possible or desirable is influenced by our class background in lots of ways, through the jobs we see people around us doing, the type and the quality of education available to us, our access to financial resources, and what sort of norms we hold about what is right for us and what we are right for. And that rather than it being a hard determinant of outcome, social class can limit career aspirations and pathways in both the short and long term throughout the life course by making some careers easier to follow than others. And we've seen some of the very interesting and perhaps less straightforward ways that this plays out in the construction sector. And so I think to finish off, we'd love to continue the discussion from earlier and perhaps have a think about how these findings about construction compared to other sectors. Is there anything here that feels really specific, or are some of these sort of opportunities and problems shared? Do we know whether other sectors are better at collecting information on class, and are the sort of ramps and barriers that we talked about similar or different elsewhere? Would be really interesting. But that is the end of our presentation. I hope we're going to share the slides because I've put a few sort of relevant IS publications that people might be interested in on a separate slide. So this research isn't published yet, but it's coming very soon, February or March. So keep an eye on the IS socials so you can read it as soon as it comes out. But I've put in there a link to last year's round of careers in construction research. So this had a very different focus. We were looking at new audience groups for CITB, particularly sort of opportunities for career-related learning in primary and early years settings. I put a great piece of research that we did for the Social Mobility Commission about the sort of link between internal migration, so moving to where the good jobs are, and social mobility. And there's some great qualitative research that I think really goes against the idea that we're all self-interested, economically maximising neoliberal citizens. And I also put a blog that I wrote about the delivery strikes a few years ago, which I think touches a bit more on sort of class power side of things, which has come up a bit less here, about the real sharp end of insecure work and how collective action can help things. But yeah, I'll hand over to you guys now to get your thoughts.
Emma, now you don't have the problem of not seeing the chats. You can pick up the reflections, hopefully. There was somebody champing at the bit, wasn't there, before we handed on to Kate?
Yes, it was Jill, wasn't it? Jill, did you want to comment?
Oh, the moment's passed now, don't worry.
Oh no.
Well, I was just going to comment on the 93% club. And one of the things I really like about them, and recognizing the complexity, and also I think it's important that we're all remembering that being state school, being a product of the state school doesn't make you working class. There are state schools and state schools, and we talked, you very helpfully mentioned the idea of privilege and economic, but also other forms of capital, enabling families to move into the catchment areas of very successful, in inverted commas, state schools. But one of the things I like about the 93% Club is the sort of advocacy and activism that they're coupling with actually supporting individuals. So, they've been active in some of the debates that have reached the press about wide participation activities in universities for courses, that very niche courses that have entry requirements that you might be much more likely to meet if you've been privately educated, for example, because of the way that some provision such as music has been affected by funding issues in state schools. So it was really to highlight that issue about advocacy and activism, as well as thinking about our practice with individuals who might feel that class is part of their identity.
Brilliant, thanks, Jill. Nadia, you've got your hand up.
Yes. Can you hear me? Okay. There was a good article a few years ago in New York's Time or whatever, that advantage runs in families the same as disadvantage. So if you look at how many people choose jobs based on what they also have their families and so on, it's quite interesting how many people choose similar to what they already know. And it's a problem for career advisor. It's a problem. So, and it's going to be there's going to be social class, you like this definition or not, there's going to be influence of what you've been subjected to, to what you are going to see. So from my perspective as a career advisor, what you could suggest to your construction industry training committee or whatever, they need to work with younger students.
Mm-hmm.
By the time, I so often hear when employers want to come and they want to talk to year 11s, they want to talk to sixth form. That's it. But wait a second. The decision they made, and they come to this point over so many years. And I already see my 7 years old, she thinks that there are some jobs for men and some for female. It's already been there, even though I'm trying to go against it. But they really need to start working more with younger people and coming there, showcasing them what is actually a job. I mean, there is a new agenda that we have to do 10 days of work experience. From a state school, I think it will fail. It will not work as it has to, because there is no resources and there is no opportunity. But the way how employers interact has to change. And the age group, I think, has to change from my perspective.
I was just going to reflecting on that. I was going to, Carl, you made a point in the chat. I don't know whether you wanted to sort of speak to that, and then bring in Kate, because I think you wanted to say something about that. But you were just reflecting on how you've seen perhaps the outcomes of the social value activity of construction firms.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I'm sort of half cooking my dinner whilst I'm doing this, so bear with me. But yeah, so I've found that in Brighton and Hove, where I'm based, and kind of around Sussex, there's a lot of construction firms that have all kind of signed up to their social value kind of contract with the local councils. So they have to do a certain amount of outreach. So this has been really, really helpful, because the Careers and Enterprise Company and the local kind of careers hubs that support all of the local schools have been really good at facilitating opening doors events, where we can get a big group of students to go and visit some of the sites, and then we get, they show us around, and they see, how to do planning for a new development. So sort of linked to architecture, and then they maybe have an interactive activity about, okay, well, if you were to be planning your own housing development, how would you do it? Where would you put the playground for the kids? Where would you put the doctor's surgery? Where would you put all of these other things and local amenities? And I think it's been a really good way of showing, like you said, some of those younger students what that could involve, not just obviously from being like a bricklayer or a labourer, but kind of more stuff to do with architecture. And if you're good at maths, then why not consider like quantity surveying and stuff, because that's going to use a lot of those numeracy skills. You're going to be managing a big budget, making sure that everything is done on time and under budget. And I think that outreach has been really, really important for those younger year groups, as well as those sixth formers, which traditionally might not have ever considered construction because they're like, oh, I've studied maths and physics or whatever, but actually seeing those transferable skills there a little bit better. So I think that's really positive. What I personally want to see is more apprenticeships at every level, because we've got, a big skills shortage, and a lot of these students really want to do an apprenticeship pathway regardless of the level. So it's just about, I think, there being more incentives for smaller companies, smaller contractors to be able to take on apprentices.
Brilliant. Thanks, Carl. Kate, did you want to come back in?
Yeah, just briefly. Yeah, thanks, Carl. That's really, really great to hear that kind of seems to be actually feeding through into people's career considerations. I did ask CITB whether they thought that the support for more in the budget, more support for smaller businesses to offer apprenticeships would have an impact. And our clients thought no, but we'll see. Because yes, do agree that we need more of those. And yeah, just coming back on what you were saying, Nadia, about the importance of early intervention, I think that keeps coming up. I think CITB construction and also like really need to tap into women. They're kind of missing a big portion of the labour force and are sort of aware of the importance of early career intervention. We wrote a really interesting, I would say, that piece of research about how to do that well last year for them, and we did hear some really nice examples of construction employers coming into primary schools and doing fun interactive activities with bricks and stuff, and showing kids that you could be a woman in construction, and hopefully breaking down some of those stereotypes. So yeah, just thought it was an important point, and it is sort of in the air a bit, I think.
And Pete, I was just looking at what you'd written in the chat, that very much about the kind of the way the construction sector's set up on that sort of project management approach to things. Sometimes they can be quite long projects, can't they? But that potential for that kind of insecurity when something ends. I don't know whether you wanted to kind
of. Well, I only posted that comment from an acquaintance of mine who works on building sites, and that's been his experience. Sometimes getting told you're not needed when you're expecting to be working for several weeks or months longer on a particular job. And it is difficult to smooth out your income, so it's feast or famine. And the benefit system has never been well attuned to people with intermittent income. It's often been a problem. So construction jobs can pay very well, but it can be inconsistent income.
Claire, did you pick up any nice threads that we should be drawing out? Oh, Claire, I think you're on mute.
I'm on mute mentally as well as mute on Zoom, I think. Yeah, I mean, there's just a very rich amount of debate in the chat, and lots of resources and thinking that we'll want to capture and share. So there isn't anything specific I picked up.
But yeah, I think everybody's been really lovely and posted lots of thoughts and ideas and shared resources, so we really appreciate those. So when we collect everything together, we'll share them too, as well as the recording. And just inviting if there was anybody who wanted to say any last thing, and then I can close up, really. anybody has a burning question or reflection.
Jill's just put in the chat about the quotes from women about what that Kyla shared about women's skills and men's skills that I think, yeah, some people had some views on.
Yeah, I would just can't let it go uncommented upon. You know, you talked about intersecting identities at the beginning, and the intersections of class and gender might be another seminar. I mean, I found that really interesting, that women are making sense of their position in the workplace in that way. But we haven't got time to really get into that now.
I think, I don't know, something that was interesting, and maybe Kyla can come in, is that these are women that are like working in quite a male-dominated sector, and often talking about how they are sort of interacting with this like lad culture that can be found, and how they quite like it, that they feel like they can sort of turn, be part of that and then turn around and speak to a client and be professional. So I think like while those quotes were quite like, oh, we're still doing like gender essentialism on a quite basic level, I think that the women we spoke to were really interesting in their reflections of sort of being women in male dominated.
That's really interesting. So they are actually performing gender in some way, as well as saying making those comments. It's a bit more.
I think that they see their sort of performance of femininity as being sort of something that helps them get by and do well, which is also really interesting. I don't know if you wanted to come in, Kyla, on any of that.
Yeah, there's an element of kind of survival in a man's world there, I guess. But I saw parallels as well between the stuff I was talking about in terms of the kind of, and Stacey alluded to this earlier, where you're less likely to see privilege when you haven't got it. And I can sort of see that with those gendered quotes as well, that it's hard to see the tools of your own oppression, sort of reaching back to some classic marks there. But yeah, I found them, Jill, as well, also kind of like, where have we come? We're not moved very far. But there is a performative element of it, yeah, that Kate alludes to as well, that might be quite interesting to dig into, and in another project.
Oh, let's persuade CITB to do some intersectional feminist research. That would be brilliant.
Well, thank you, everybody. We're sort of approaching our end point at 6:30, but I just want to say thank you very much to Kate and Kyla for coming along and letting me nobble you to come and do this seminar. But we really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you
lots of positive comments in the chat about how clear and thought-provoking it's been. So thank you for that. And I think for me, there's a lovely segue into the next NICEC event that we're hoping to have on the 18th of March, because that's how do we learn to be career development professionals? And I think you're capturing in the discussion today just how complex that is, with the theoretical underpinning, the how do you actually structure interventions in a way that broadens people's horizons for actions. And it's not an easy job, is it, to carry through. So thanks very much, and we hope to see people again on the 18th of March, and we'll certainly capture the chat as well as the slides. So thanks, Emma, for organising your wonderful colleagues to come along today.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for coming along and for sharing your thoughts and reflections. So we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. My rainbow wall's disappearing now.
We've loved it.